Have you ever coached a leader through a moment of crisis where the pressure was so high that they, nearly cracked under composure? And what did the work involve when you coached them?
So that's something that's happened on a number of different occasions. Where you're working with a founder or an MD or CEO, there is often a lot of underlying pressure, which is kind of like, it's almost a daily routine. We've got to make sure we've got to make these contracts, we've got to deliver our service, we've got to look after our team. I've got challenges to deal with within the team. We've got stakeholders that we've got to look after. And then, the proverbial hits the fan. And then suddenly it's all on you. You're at the core of this business. And so suddenly every decision you make is one that's creating and compounding this pressure. More often than not, it certainly revolves around financial, challenges, the money. Let's be honest, people go into business in order to generate wealth and to make money. And, that I personally, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I wouldn't be doing this business if that wasn't the case. Go back to the beginning of COVID. We literally went from one day where there's talk about being locked down to a few days later, and then suddenly unprecedented UK national, you're not going anywhere, you've got to stay at home. For me personally, at that point, we ended up running a whole series of kind of like online events, which were crisis planning. The word pivot was massively overused through COVID for all the right reasons. But what we ended up with was a whole series of examples where business owners, and I can remember a number of them, that they're literally in panic, and we'd message and then we jump onto a video call and we're having that conversation. What came out of it, and it goes back to this thing, I've talked about it quite a lot, is taking a moment. You take yourself a moment. Now, we're wired through our freeze, flight and fight to immediately react and respond. Suddenly out of the corner of your eye, you see a bus coming down, you want to be able to leap back onto it. And that's right, yeah. Freeze, flight and fight in its... But when we trigger that through things that don't necessarily do it, it creates this panic. Money does that. It creates this panic. And yet it's kind of like the analogy is like, false expectations appearing real. So we manifest things. To be able to help someone and induce that pregnant pause, just to take a moment to think about, okay, so what? And a very simple question to ask is, so what? Okay, so what? What's happening? So what? Then you can start to go through a process of looking for, I often talk about the gift and opportunity. All right, this is preventing it or presenting a challenge for us. What's the gift and opportunity? All right, so we've got a particular, how do we navigate around that problem? It might be a people challenge, in which case, we look at, being a little bit more, focused on individuals or people behaviors, being, an anthropologist and thinking, all right, so why are they behaving that way? What is it that I can do in order to negate that or help that or overcome that? And then it's kind of like we just think about things in a very, very practical and logical manner, like parking the emotional piece.
Yeah.
So when you're able to see that, you can then coach that. When you've experienced it yourself and you understand how it turns up in yourself, and you've got those coping mechanisms. So for me as a coach, working under pressure is something I've done probably more than most people in a lifetime, but that's just the nature of being in the military. Having said that, the last 13 years of being out here, working with business owners, I've seen it firsthand. And don't get me wrong, I'm a business owner in my own right. I've experienced it in my own hand. It's not just all green and rosy and lovely fields of wonder in business. Business is challenging, it's tough. But just being able to take that pregnant pause, that moment, that thought, to then determine, right, how do we then approach this? I think that's a real key point there. It helps the client, and again, when you see a client, their light go on that epiphany, it's kind of like, it's fantastic. And then you can help them logically work through the problem, just through asking good questions.